Well, now come on in and set yourself down by the fire, folks. Old Silas has got a peculiar little tale for you this evening. One that took me the better part of 75 years to understand proper. It's about supper. Now, I reckon you're thinking, Silas, what in the world does a plate of beans and cornbread have to do with a good night's rest? But I tell you, there was a wisdom in how our grandparents took their evening meal that most folks nowadays have gone and forgotten entirely. And it's a wisdom that near always, not always, mind you, but near always, set them up for a peaceful night. The kind of peaceful you don't hardly find no more. I recollect it clear as if it were yesterday. I couldn't have been more than 8 years old, sitting at my grandpa Elias's table, my belly rumbling something fierce from a long day of chores. My grandmother Eleanor would be standing over that old iron stove, stirring a pot of stew that smelled of onions and salt pork. And my little brother Tommy, he was maybe 5 then, would be tugging at her apron, asking when supper'd be ready, same as he did every single evening, Lord love him. Now here's the peculiar part, folks. My grandpa Elias, he had a rule about supper that I didn't understand as a boy, and honestly, I fought against it something awful. He wouldn't let us sit down to eat till the sun had dipped good and low behind the ridge. Didn't matter if we were hungry at 4 in the afternoon, and believe me, Tommy hollered about it plenty. Grandpa Elias held firm. Supper comes with the dusk, he'd say. Not before it, not long after it neither. And then, once we'd eaten, there weren't no rushing off to bed. No, sir. There was a whole quiet stretch of evening that came after, and I reckon that stretch was the secret, though none of us called it that back then. You see, in them days, a family didn't just eat and scatter. Once the plates were cleared, and clearing them was a chore in itself, with Eleanor washing every dish by hand in a basin of water she had heated on the stove, the family would gather near the hearth. Grandpa Elias would take to whittling, slow and unhurried, shavings curling down into a little pile by his boot. Eleanor would mend a torn shirt or darn a sock, her needle catching the firelight. And Tommy and I, we'd just lay there on the rug, listening to the fire crackle, maybe listening to Grandpa tell some story about his own paw, or about the winter of some hard year gone by. There weren't no rushing. That's what strikes me now, looking back on it. The whole evening had a kind of slowness to it that I don't rightly see much of anymore. Folks these days, they eat their supper quick, sometimes standing up even, and then they're right back to bustling about, minds racing on to the next thing before their stomachs even settled. But my grandpa, he had a saying for it. He'd say, "A man that rushes his supper rushes his sleep right along with it." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand it a good deal better now. Because I tell you folks, there was something happening in that quiet hour after supper. Something in the way the body eased itself down, the way the mind stopped its churning, the way the whole cabin seemed to settle into stillness right along with the family inside it. It weren't magic, It weren't nothing you could bottle up and sell. It was just time. Time given generous, without hurry, to let a body come down off the busyness of the day before ever laying head to pillow. Now, I aim to tell you exactly what went on in that hour and why it mattered so much more than folks nowadays might reckon. There's a reason our grandparents rested easier than most of us do today, and it starts with something as simple and as overlooked as what time of evening they chose to eat and what they did with the hours after. So stay close to the fire now, and let me tell you what my Grandpa Elias understood about supper that most of the world has since forgotten. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the hour after supper. Let me tell you a bit more about how that hour was spent in my grandpa's cabin, because I reckon it'll paint a clearer picture for you of just what I'm getting at. Once the dishes were put away and the fire built up a bit higher against the coming chill, my grandmother Eleanor had herself a habit. She'd brew a small pot of chamomile, picked and dried from her own garden patch out back, and she'd pour Grandpa Elias a cup and pour a smaller one for me and Tommy too, though ours had more honey in it than hers did on account of we complained something terrible about the bitterness otherwise. She'd sit there sipping it slow, and she always said the same thing near every night. "Drink it slow, children. Ain't no prize for finishing first." Tommy hated waiting. He'd gulp his down and then sit there swinging his legs off the bench, restless as a colt, till Grandpa Elias would give him a look and he'd settle some. I think on that a lot these days, that phrase, "ain't no prize for finishing first," because in them times there just weren't the same rush to everything that there is now. Supper wasn't a thing you finished so you could get on to the next task. Supper, and the hour that followed it, was the task. It was the whole point of the evening, near as I can figure. Now, let's talk a bit about how families back then generally lived their evenings, because it weren't just my own grandpa's cabin that ran this way. This was common practice across most every frontier household I ever knew of. And from what I've gathered talking to old folks over the years, it held true in the towns too, not just out here on the prairie. Families in them days worked hard from sun up, and by the time evening rolled around, there was an understanding, unspoken most times, that the evening belonged to slowness. Chores were done, the animals were fed and settled, and once supper was cleared, there weren't hardly nothing left to do but sit and talk and let the day drain on out of you. Compare that, if you will, to how so many folks live nowadays. I've seen it myself on them rare trips into the bigger towns. Families eating their supper hurried, half-standing, minds all ready to tomorrow's business, or fretting over some worry from the day that never did get put down. And then straight to bed they go, worry and all, like a man trying to sleep with his boots still on and his hat still cinched tight. It don't work well, folks. I tell you, it don't work well at all. There was a particular evening I recall. I couldn't have been more than 10 when a traveling peddler came through and stayed the night at our cabin on account of a storm rolling in something fierce. He was a city man from back east, and he ate his supper in about a quarter of the time it took the rest of us, then sat there fidgeting by the fire, asking Grandpa Elias when he ought to be getting to bed since he had an early start planned. Grandpa just chuckled and said, "You'll sleep when your supper's settled, friend, and not a moment before. Sit a while." That peddler grumbled some, but he sat, and come morning he told my grandpa it was the soundest sleep he'd had in near a year of traveling. Grandpa just nodded like he already knew. Now, I don't tell you these things to make you feel poorly about how you take your own supper these days. Times are different. I understand that well enough. But I do think there's something in this old way of doing things worth turning over in your mind, worth understanding a little deeper, because there's a reason it worked the way it did, and it weren't just habit or superstition. There was something real happening, something about how the body eases itself from the business of eating into the business of resting. And I aim to explain that part to you next, so stay with me a while longer, won't you? As I've learned over the years, modern doctors would likely say my grandparents were helping their bodies digest before asking them to sleep. They didn't know the science by name, but they surely knew the results. Now, let's get into the heart of the matter, because I reckon you've been patient enough waiting on it. Why is it exactly that rushing supper, rushing off to bed right after made for such a poor night's sleep? Why did that slow evening hour, the one I've been telling you about, tend to set a body up so much better? Well, I never had no schooling in these matters, mind you. I'm just an old man who's lived a long while and thought on things a great deal. But my grandpa Elias, he had a way of explaining the natural world in plain terms a boy could understand. And I reckon I can pass some of that along to you now. See, when a body sits down to a hurried meal, eating fast and heavy, and then goes right off to lay down before the food's had time to settle, there's a kind of labor going on inside that don't sit well alongside the labor of falling asleep. It's like asking a horse to pull two wagons at once, folks. One wagon full of victuals still being digested, and another wagon full of the body trying to wind down and rest. That horse can pull one wagon fine. Ask him to pull both at the same time, and he's liable to get himself in a state, restless and uneasy, same as a person tossing about in bed with a heavy stomach and a racing mind. My grandpa Elias always said the secret was in the waiting, not eating too late, not eating too heavy, and then giving the body a good stretch of quiet time, an hour, sometimes closer to 2, before ever laying down. That stretch of time, that's when the body could finish its work of digesting without also being asked to do the work of falling asleep. 2 different jobs done one after the other, instead of both crammed together and neither one done well. And there was more to it than just the eating, too. That quiet hour by the fire, the whittling, the mending, the storytelling, I believe now that served a purpose all its own. See, a mind that's been running hard all day, worrying on chores and troubles and the next day's work, that mind don't just stop the moment you blow out the candle. It keeps on running a while, same as a horse keeps turning after the wagon stopped moving. That quiet hour gave the mind a chance to slow its turning, gradual-like, instead of trying to stop it dead all at once. Grandpa Elias used to say a mind stopped too sudden is like a horse pulled up short. It rears up and fights you. But a mind eased down slow, why it comes to rest gentle, same as a horse walked down to a stop instead of yanked. I remember one evening, must have been deep winter, when Tommy had gotten himself all worked up over some argument with a neighbor boy, and he wanted to just storm off to bed angry, skip the whole quiet hour entirely. Grandpa Elias wouldn't hear of it. He sat Tommy down by the fire and had him work a bit of whittling alongside him. Didn't say much of nothing for a good while, just let him sit there. And slowly, gradual as the fire burning down to embers, I watched my brother's shoulders come down from around his ears, watched his fists unclench, watched the anger just sort of drain on out of him. By the time he did lay down that night, he was calm as still water, and he slept sound as anything. No more thought of that neighbor boy troubling him. That's the piece so many folks miss nowadays, I think. It ain't just about what you eat or when you eat it, though that matters plenty. It's about giving the whole self, body and mind both, a proper chance to ease down slow
instead of expecting rest to arrive sudden and complete the moment you shut your eyes. Rest, I've come to believe, ain't a door you walk through all at once. It's more like a long, slow path down a hillside, and you gotta give yourself the time to walk it. Now, there's more to this old way of living that I ain't told you yet. Some particular habits my grandmother Eleanor kept that I believe helped this whole process along even further. So don't go wandering off just yet. Let me tell you about Eleanor's evening ways, and I think you'll find some real comfort in them.
My grandmother Eleanor now, she had her own particular wisdom about evenings, separate from Grandpa Elias's rules about supper time. And I reckon it's worth telling, because I believe it worked hand in hand with everything else to make for a peaceful night. Eleanor kept what she called her settling tasks. Every evening, without fail, she had some small task she turned her hands to after supper. Mended, as I mentioned, or carding wool, or sometimes just sitting with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, doing nothing much at all but watching the fire. And she always said the same thing to me and Tommy. Give your hands something quiet to do, children, and your mind will follow along quiet too. I didn't think much of this as a boy. It seemed like just an old woman's habit, nothing more. But I've come to see the sense in it since. See, when Tommy and I would come in from a day of rough chores, chopping wood, hauling water, chasing after wayward chickens, our hands and our minds were both still buzzing with the day's business. If we'd gone straight from that buzzing straight to bed, I don't imagine we'd have slept easy at all. But Eleanor's settling tasks, they were a kind of bridge, I suppose you could say, a gentle little path between the busy work of the day and the stillness of the night. She had me help her with mending sometimes, showed me how to thread a needle and make a simple stitch, though I was clumsy at it and pricked my fingers more than once, much to Tommy's amusement. But there was something in the repetition of it, needle in, needle out, needle in, needle out, that had a calming effect I couldn't rightly explain as a child. It was slow, it was simple, it asked just enough of my attention to keep my mind from wandering off to worry about tomorrow, but not so much that it kept me wound up and alert. And I tell you, this weren't just Eleanor's peculiar way of doing things. I've heard tell from other families in the territory that kept similar habits, the women folk especially, though the men had their own versions too, Grandpa Elias with his whittling being one example. It seemed near every household back then understood, even if they never spoke it aloud, that a body needed some manner of gentle transition between the day's labor and the night's rest. Nobody expected to just drop into sleep the way you drop a stone into a well. It was understood to be a gradual thing, same as a fire dying down. Doesn't go out all at once. It embers down slow, glowing less and less until it's just warm ash. There was a particular evening I remember well, when a bad storm kept us cooped up in the cabin for near 3 days straight, and by the second evening, Tommy and I were about ready to climb the walls with restlessness. Eleanor, bless her, set us both to shelling a great sack of dried beans just to give our hands something to occupy themselves with. We must have shelled beans for the better part of an hour, and I recall feeling that same gradual calm settle over me that I'd felt with the mending before. Tommy, restless as he was, even he quieted down eventually, humming some little tune to himself as his hands worked the shells apart. Now here's a curious thing I've noticed over my many years since. Nowadays, so many folks feel their evening hours with quite the opposite of a settling task. Instead of something slow and repetitive for the hands, they occupy themselves with things that keep the mind racing faster, not slower, worrying over this or that, minds jumping from one thought to the next without ever finding a gentle stopping place. And then they wonder why sleep don't come easy, why they lay there tossing about long after they've blown out the lamp. I don't fault anybody for how they choose to spend their evenings, mind you. Times have changed, and I understand that well enough. But I do think there's a real comfort to be found in reviving some small piece of what my grandmother Eleanor understood, that the mind, like the body, needs a gentle path down to rest, not a sudden drop. Now, there's one more piece to this whole evening ritual I ain't told you about yet, and I reckon it might be the most important piece of all. It has to do with what my family didn't do in the evenings just as much as what they did. So stay a while longer, and I'll tell you about that next.
Now, I've told you what my grandpa Elias did in the evenings and what my grandmother Eleanor did, but I reckon it's just as important, maybe more so, to tell you what they didn't do. Because I've come to believe the absence of certain things mattered every bit as much as the presence of the settling tasks and the slow suppers. See, in them days, once the sun went down and the lamps were lit, there just weren't the same manner of bright, harsh light that folks are surrounded by nowadays. Our cabin was lit by lamplight and firelight, both of them soft, both of them warm in color, flickering low and gentle. There weren't no bright white light glaring down on us the way I understand folks have in their homes today. And I believe, though I can't speak to the particulars of why, that this soft evening light played its own part in easing a body toward sleep. My grandpa Elias used to say that the evening ought to feel different from the day, plain and simple. The day is bright and busy, he'd tell me, and the evening ought to feel like it's winding down to meet the night, not fighting against it. And so, come sundown, even the light in our cabin seemed to understand its place. Soft, low, amber-colored, nothing like the harsh brightness of midday sun. I recall visiting a cousin's family once out near the edge of the territory who'd gotten hold of some newer style of lamp that burned brighter than what we were used to. And I remember feeling almost unsettled by it that evening, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. It was too bright, too much like daylight carried on past its proper hour. I didn't sleep near as well that night as I did back in my own grandpa's cabin, and I've wondered on that many times since. There was also the matter of quiet. Our evenings were quiet in a way that I don't believe most folks experience much anymore. There weren't no noise beyond the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of conversation, maybe the wind picking up outside. Grandpa Elias didn't believe in loud talk after supper, and he certainly didn't believe in stirring up arguments or hard conversations once evening set in. Save your troubles for daylight, he'd say. The dark ain't the time to go picking at old wounds. If Tommy and I got to squabbling in the evening, Grandpa would put a stop to it quick, not harsh, but firm. He understood, I believe, that carrying trouble and argument into the dark hours only stirred up the mind right when it ought to be settling down. I think of Eleanor, too, in these quiet evenings, humming softly to herself sometimes as she worked her mending. Nothing more than a low, wandering tune, no particular song I could ever name. And I believe that quiet humming, same as the soft light and the slow tasks, was just another piece of the same puzzle. Everything in that evening hour conspiring together, gentle and unhurried, to walk a body down toward sleep rather than push it there sudden. Now, I want to be fair with you folks and not paint too rosy a picture. Life on the frontier weren't without its hardships, and there were plenty evenings that didn't go so smooth. Sickness in the family, hard news from a neighbor, worry over a poor harvest. Old Silas ain't claiming our grandparents always slept perfect every single night, never troubled. That'd be a foolish thing to claim, and untrue besides. But I do believe, more often than not, they gave themselves a fighting chance at good rest, on account of how they structured their evenings, and that's a good deal more than what most folks manage nowadays. So there you have it, folks. The slow supper, the settling tasks, the soft light, the quiet talk, all of it working together evening after evening to ease a family down from the business of the day into the stillness of the night. Now, before I let you go on to your own rest this evening, I want to leave you with a little something more, a way of thinking on all this that I hope might serve you well in your own evenings. So don't wander off just yet.
Well, folks, we're coming toward the end of our fire tonight, but I wanted to leave you with a few thoughts before you go on to your own rest, on account of I believe there's something in all this old wisdom that still holds true, even in these busier, faster times we live in now. I think back on my grandpa Elias and my grandmother Eleanor often, and on that quiet hour they gave to every single evening, near without fail, all them years. It wasn't nothing fancy. It wasn't nothing that cost a single coin. It was just time, given generous, and a handful of simple habits, eating supper unhurried, sitting quiet with some small task for the hands, keeping the light and the talk soft and low, letting the day drain on out before ever laying down to sleep. I've lived a long while now, folks, long enough to see the world change considerable from the one I grew up in, and I'll admit there's plenty about them changes I find useful and good. But I do believe something got lost along the way, too, in how we tend to our evenings, in how we let ourselves ease down from the day's business into the night's rest. Most folks nowadays rush their supper, same as that peddler I told you about, and then rush right off towards sleep, minds still racing, bodies still full of the day's noise, and then they wonder why rest don't come easy, while they lay there tossing about long into the dark hours. Now, I ain't got no cure-all for you folks. I'm just an old man who remembers how his grandparents lived, and who's come to believe there was a real wisdom in it, even if they never called it wisdom themselves. To them, it was just how an evening was spent, plain and simple. But I do think there's something worth trying, if you're willing. Maybe it's giving yourself just a little more time between supper and sleep, unhurried, without rushing. Maybe it's finding some small, quiet task for your hands of an evening, same as my grandmother Eleanor with her mending. Something slow and repetitive to ease your mind down gradual. Maybe it's just dimming the lights a bit sooner, letting the evening feel like evening, different from the busy brightness of the day, same as my grandpa always believed it ought to. I think of Tommy often, too, my little brother, all them years ago, restless and fidgety as a young colt, hollering about supper being too late, fighting against the quiet hour, same as any child might. But even he came to settle into it eventually, same as all of us did, and I believe he slept sounder for it, all them years we were children together in that cabin. There's a particular memory I'll leave you with tonight, folks. It was late autumn, the leaves all gone from the trees, first frost setting in hard. Grandpa Elias, Eleanor, Tommy, and myself all gathered close by the fire after a simple supper of stew and bread, the lamp turned down low, Eleanor's needle catching what little light there was, Grandpa's whittling knife working slow and steady, curls of wood falling soft onto the hearth. Nobody said much of nothing. There were no need to. And I remember feeling, even as a young boy, a kind of peace settle over that whole cabin, thick and warm as the quilts on our beds. And I recall thinking, though I couldn't have put it in these words back then, that this was exactly how an evening ought to feel. I hope in some small way this old story of mine has given you something to carry into your own evening tonight, folks. Maybe you'll find a quiet task for your hands. Maybe you'll let your supper settle a while longer before you lay your head down. Maybe you'll dim the lights just a touch sooner and let the evening ease you toward the night,
gentle as my Grandpa Elias always believed it should. Whatever you choose, I wish you a peaceful night, same as I wish for myself, same as my grandparents wished for me all them years ago beside that old hearth fire. Rest easy now, folks. Come sundown, may your evening be slow, and may your night be still. Good night, and Lord have mercy. Sleep well.